Thank you everyone for joining me today. My name is Bill Kartalopoulos. I'm the programming director for the MoCA Comic Arts Festival and the series editor for the Best American Comics. I'm very pleased to be here today with three artists who I admire greatly. I suspect that you know all, or at least most of them, and those whose work you don't know, I think you'll have a chance to see very thoroughly right now. So for the moment, please join me in welcoming Sam Alden, Michael DeForge, and Frederic Coché to this stage. The sort of pretext for this conversation and the reason to have this particular group of artists together, and I realize that many of you probably can't see me behind the computer. I'm training to be a member of Daft Punk, and this is just the first week. But anyway, but the pretext for this panel is that, to me, one of the things that's very exciting about comics today is that I feel like there's a real variety of materials and modes of expression available to artists, and that artists are currently exploring. Because for so much of the history of comics, it was really a history of a certain kind of line work that was intended to survive a certain kind of reproduction process. Most of the history of comics is about, low-cost, mass-produced artwork. So you're talking about a black, solid line that can withstand a certain kind of photographic reproduction, often printed on not very good papers, particularly in the US, less the case in Europe. And now we're in a time where I think there are two or three things that have really revolutionized the look of comics. One is digital printing technology, which has certainly made it easier to authentically and affordably reproduce things like pencil and paint and things like that. The other side of that is digital reproduction online, which is kind of ironically has actually made it very easy for people to sort of show work that has a very handmade quality without even having to print it on paper. You can paint something or draw with colored pencils or pastels or whatever and scan it on the computer and put it on Tumblr, and people are actually seeing something very close to what you made. Sometimes sharper and more colorful than if you printed it on paper. Unless you're using like very good art paper and you have wonderful color separators like at Framoka, and we can talk about that too. So there's that. Also, of course, the digital palette includes pure digital aesthetics, and that's another thing that's expanding the range. And finally, I think the other thing that's really expanding the range of what comics can look like is that we've definitely, as comics have become more prominent and mainstream, there's less of a kind of boundary between comics and the sort of the art school world or the fine art world. And I think people are less afraid, people who come from maybe art school backgrounds are less afraid to try making comics, and people in comics are less afraid to try and incorporate art world influences. There's less of this anxiety that it's like too pretentious to make a painted comic or something like that. I think that in America that's a more recent phenomenon maybe than in Europe. So anyway, that's enough from that's enough of my thesis statement. I just wanted to sort of set the tone or set the table for this conversation. And I think all three of the artists here, if you look at the history of their artwork individually, they show a lot of fascinating development. And part of that has to do with figuring out materials and styles and how those things interact with what it is that you actually want to express. So I'm gonna show some work from each of these artists just one at a time, just to kind of see the sort of cycle a little bit. So bear with me, I will get to everyone. Michael, this is something you posted online. I'm just quoting you. I found a copy of my first mini comic from grade 10 or 11, so I scanned some pages from it. Yeah. So Is this the first published thing that you did?
It must have been. I might have. I probably did a few zines before.
Uh-huh.
Oh, I definitely did, I guess. But this was one of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is very old.
Yeah. When you look at this, I mean, obviously it looks very old compared to your current work. Do you see things here that make you think like, oh yeah, that's still me, or I still do that in the same way, or whatever?
Yeah, not technique-wise, but it's like I still don't know how to draw the human body very well, and like I'd still draw everybody with like popsicle stick arms and oversized heads a lot of the time. But yeah, like I never learned perspective clearly. Yeah, but yeah, I was drawing all this with, I think I must have used Sharpie markers, but I was still cleaning it up on the computer, and then yeah.
These are, I think probably like a lot of people, I first saw your work when Annie Koyama started publishing the Lose comic book series.
Mm-hmm.
I know that like I've heard, you know, people, specifically people in Toronto, like, you know, Chris Butcher, who had probably seen your work around for a while in zines, and there was a free drawings newspaper in Toronto that I think you had a lot of work in. These are some early zines of yours that I think Ryan Sands posted online that he found, I think, before you started publishing Lose with Annie.
Yeah.
So how are you drawing this stuff, and in what ways do you see this as being similar to or different from what you're doing now?
I think these would have all been maybe when I was in university for like a minute, and yeah, this was, I think, was when I was figuring out how I wanted to incorporate, or I was like figuring out how much I wanted to draw the tablet and how I could like speed up the process, because yeah, they were all just like me figuring out comics, I guess, and you know, like many cartoonists, being frustrated at how labor intensive and slow it could be, especially for the type of artwork I wanted to make, which I know I have very conservative, clean lines, but I fuck up a lot, and I have to I was using a lot of whiteout and globbing on panels and then photocopying things to get a cleaner version and then adding onto the photocopies.
Part of this figuring out process was like sort of imitating and sort of parodying other styles too?
Yeah, I wasn't sure, like, the way I draw sort of normally is like a lot of weird freehand stuff that never makes it into my comics, just because, I don't want to be loose in my comics, and I was drawing really loose, I was just drawing really loose before. I was, the artists I was, I guess, imitating before were like Mark Bell or Keith Jones or Pete Thompson, and but then I realized I didn't want the artwork wasn't suiting the sorts of stories I wanted to tell. So I figured out just, I wasn't drawing fully digital yet, but this was when I was like cleaning things up a lot more and realizing like, oh, this can speed it up, and yeah. And
in terms of style, though, was part of copying this stuff trying to get closer to that sort of like pro-type, machine-ready line that a lot of these comic strip artists had to master in order to do their work?
Yeah, well, and also imitating other cartoonists and like studying it that way made it kind of, it was just a way of like learning how to construct a comic. Like, oh, how flat can I make things, or how flat can I get away with it, or what sort of cheating can I do? Yeah.
One of the first narrative things of yours that I think I saw was, and probably when I saw Lose, it didn't even connect it to this work right away, was this serial. I think I became aware of it later when it was on like the Top Shelf website, but you had it on some sort of blog spot.
Yeah, my old live journal.
Yeah. Was this, where would you place this? Was this part of a figuring out process for you?
Yeah, this was around the same time. Yeah, and it was still just, this was just another attempt at doing something a bit longer. It took me a while. It wasn't until Lose 1 where I was able to even finish anything over, finishing anything over like 15 pages or something.
Where it was, it seems like you were trying to build up to like telling maybe a longer kind of story or something like that, the way you're talking about it now. Was having a kind of style that you just felt really comfortable with, and that you weren't feeling sort of like you were struggling with part of it, or was it more just figuring out what the story you were more committed to telling?
It was more about figuring out the story. Like, I did lose after a really bad year in my life, and it just was like, oh, I guess it's that like common thing where it's like, well, I didn't really have anything to write about yet, and then I had something to write about. But yeah, because I feel like with a lot of loos, I switch styles, and I kind of just realized like it doesn't really matter if I settle on one. Like there are sequences in loos that I was trying to get away with something that maybe looks more like Peter Bag drawings or something, but then the rest of it has, you know, this really tight, dense grid. And yeah, like I even think on that page before, like, yeah, just the grass there doesn't look like anything else in the issue or something. Like, they're just weird parts of it like that. But I kind of realized it's fine and that it'll figure itself out as I go.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things about this is that, like, you're sort of imitating other artists' styles and kind of bringing it all together, so that creates a kind of opening to allow all kinds of different things to coexist, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm. You had posted on your Flickr around the time that comic came out, this...
This is like a Wally Wood spread from Mad, I think. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Were you looking at how other artists were like copying or imitating or parodying popular styles, or was this just something that you liked?
Yeah, just something I liked. I like came across and was like, oh, look at this thing.
Yeah. And it's kind of interesting how, like, on the one hand, you're drawing these other characters in their style, but at a certain point, like, I think this is from the Marvel Strange Tales that you contributed to.
Yeah.
Now you're drawing other people's characters, but in a style that people would recognize as your style.
Sure.
What do you think people recognize about your style when they look at something like this? I know it's a hard question to answer.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the way I lay out grids and, like, always have just sort of two people walking on very flat planes. And I kind of alternate between comics where I draw really dense stuff and draw really stark, minimal stuff. But I think I'm maybe recognized more for the dense stuff. Yeah, like stuff like that, I guess.
Yeah. And you told me, I know you talked about how even as far back as like some of the early college stuff, you were experimenting with, you know, using the Wacom and incorporating that a little bit. You mentioned that you told me via email that Lose 2 was probably the first one in the series where you did all of the inking digitally.
Yeah.
Which is now, I think, how you do all of your comics inking.
Yeah.
You do occasionally publish these zines called Loose that have pages from your sketchbook. You also sent me this thing that's kind of a comparison of a sort of sketchbook version of a page and then the digital inked version. What does the digital ink give you that the sketch version doesn't have? Why is that to you maybe the more exact representation of what it is that you want to communicate?
I think just because like I can just get that really tight line, and doing it digitally just is so much faster for me at this point. It was also a pretty easy transition. Like if I was drawing with like a brush or something before, it would have been harder to just pick up a tablet and then try to replicate that brush line and have it be organic or like a natural transition. But the way I was inking by hand was like I just would ink with a really skinny kind of dead pen line, and that's really easy to do on a computer. So,
Right,
yeah.
right. Well, and we saw how in some ways you were looking at like old comic strips and things like that that had that kind of tightness to them. Were there other artists whose work had that kind of precision or, you know, regularity that you were that you admired or maybe aspired to emulate in some way?
Yeah, like I try to like look at Adrian Tamine and Dan Klaus for their lines a lot, because I mean they have like their lines vary in width a lot more than mine, but I would sort of study how like invisible they kind of seem. Like yeah, I don't know. They seem to have like perfect lines when I looked at them.
Yeah. One of the things that's kind of interesting, kind of looking at some of the variety of your work, and you're very productive, so there's a huge variety of it. And you mentioned before how sometimes you have dense pages, sometimes very open pages, and it looks like you experiment with style, but it also kind of depends what you mean by style. Sometimes when I'm teaching students, and you know, I have to cue them when they say style to talk about what they're talking about. If they mean like line weight or how like dense or open it is, or if they're talking about the way the characters are constructed. And it looking at a bunch of your work, it seems like things like line weight don't maybe vary so much, but you do, one thing you do vary a lot is just the kind of way you construct your characters, how you build them out of like different kinds of shapes.
Sure.
Does that seem like an area that you would like to find like a one way of doing it, or do you like to keep that open and play around with that in a lot of different ways?
Oh, yeah, I like keeping it open. I get sick of drawing a certain way or coloring a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
And even just that thing of like getting sick of drawing the same character, I imagine I'd have to be really happy with a character design to, like I had this conversation last night. There's a comic where I'm just gonna have a character shave his head because, and it's just because I don't want to draw his hair anymore. And it has to go on longer, and I can't like imagine myself drawing 100 more pages of this haircut. So, but yeah, I get bored a lot, I guess, working on one thing, so I try to switch it up. And for character design, that's something I like playing around with, because I think I'm really interested in awkward design. Like
awkward design.
Character construction. So.
Yeah. And you do some of this kind of stuff professionally for Adventure Time?
Yeah.
These are yours? Is this yours?
That's one of mine. Yeah.
Okay. And here's like another one. It looks like a horrible tapeworm made out of hot dogs or something.
Yep, that's another one of mine.
Is this the kind of construction you're talking about, like awkward and wrong?
Yeah, a little bit. They sort of throw me that stuff on the show because they know that I enjoy doing those ones in particular. So they're like, yeah, let's let Michael do the stupid hot dog monster. Throw me a bone.
Yeah, and I know all this Adventure Time stuff you must do digitally because there's such a rapid turnaround time on this.
Yeah, like I get a lot of revisions, and then it'd be really awful to have to scan each a million things every week. Yeah.
Sam, I want to show some images of your stuff because I feel like I've become aware of your work very recently, and you're already kind of experimenting a lot with different styles. I know, Michael, when I was researching some of your old stuff, I found some dead links to live journals that you've deleted from the internet. Sam, on the other hand, has not been so careful. I'm not trying to embarrass you, but no, I mean, I hope you're not embarrassed, because I think that's like a really awesome thing about the way the internet now is that people kind of just sort of own themselves and don't like, it's sort of be like, oh, don't look at my old stuff. It's kind of like, well, it's all there. Everyone's kind of an open book. I don't know if that's good or bad, but it's sort of the way the world is. I think I always wondered why your website was called Gingerland, and I think this is a comic serial you started years ago, probably like in high school or something, called Gingerland.
This is some incredibly deep digging, Phil. Yeah. I drew that when I was 19.
Well, it's not that hard though, because your website, like if people sort of follow the right labyrinthine path, they can find like a lot of really old stuff. But anyway, but I mean, my point really is just that you were starting to make comics and put them online and even self-publish them at a very young age. This is something you mentioned as a kind of abandoned project. It was a sort of online graphic novel. Maybe you were in college when you were working on this.
Yeah.
And you published, I don't know how many pages of this online.
I think this ended up being almost 200 pages. It was this kind of, it was called 8th grade. It was like this sort of like black and white, angsty, like white teenagers thing. I was basically just trying to draw like Nate Powell or Craig Thompson, who was a big, like all those like top shelf guys in 2002 or whatever. And I think that this was like going to be my big release. I pictured this big like brick-sized thing coming out when I was 23, and I think I ended up getting bored with it because I was basically working on something that a 19-year-old had conceived, and I wasn't 19.
So you say your influences were kind of particularly a few artists like Nate Powell and Craig Thompson and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that those were, I was interning for Top Shelf at the time, and so I think I was trying to draw something that looked like what like a capital G graphic novel was supposed to look like in my head, which at that time was very, very like high contrast black and white, really like brush centric. It was really, there's all this kind of, there's so much emphasis on like the line and getting those like sexy, thin to thick lines
Mhm,
to
mhm.
describe everything. And, yeah.
There's some other stuff beyond the graphic novel that also indicates a kind of experimentation. This was a short story that you had online called Garden Spectre. I think I might have seen an old interview with you somewhere where you said this was influenced by manga. Were there other artists you were looking at and trying to sort of emulate?
Yeah, did you ever read The Boxman?
I haven't read that one.
Yeah, I was really into that book. I was like, this was my junior year of college or something, and that and Susumu Katsumata, who did Red Snow, were really like exciting discoveries for me at that time. So I did this sort of like unreadable dream comic with lots of like gardens and octopi and stuff.
And this is another kind of, I mean, it's only a couple of years old, but it feels like early in quotation marks just because I feel like there's a certain body of work that you've now become known for, and very quickly, and anything, you know, from before, it just seems like, you know, quote unquote earlier. It's not that long ago, but your work has changed a lot since then. This one to me, when I read this story, I felt like, very specifically, this reminded me of Craig's work a little bit, just in terms of the anthropomorphic and a kind of, I mean, the tone was very different, but it had sort of that kind of combination of like anthropomorphic, a little kind of wistful or sad feeling on some level, and the kind of beautiful sort of brushy lines.
Yeah, I was definitely, this was like, I did this about a year ago, and a little over a year ago actually, and yeah, I don't know, this was like the first sort of short story that I did, and so I was working in, I think with nib and trying to like do this kind of Tove Jansson thing. And,
I think the first story of yours that everyone, that a lot of people I know saw, was the Serial Haunter, that was serialized on the study group website. I don't know if it was posted before that on maybe your own site for a while, and then it started going in study group. I noticed it when it was posted to study group because there's a lot of comics on there, and so it's a good place to find things. But this was kind of an example of what I was talking about before, in the sense that this, you know, is very clearly something that you produced, looks to me like pen and ink and watercolor, and you know, sometimes you can even see like the kind of texture of the, you know, damp paper and so on, and this is something that, you know, actually reproduces very cleanly online, I think, and it would almost be hard to get those colors quite so vibrant printing on paper. What can you talk a little bit about your choice of materials here and why this was appropriate to this particular story, which was a kind of wordless, kind of very movement-oriented story?
yeah, totally. Well, this was, I started this also when I was in college, so when I was still working on that giant, like, unfunny tome of a graphic novel. And this really felt like an exercise more than anything else. I was just sort of doing it for fun, and as a way to, I wanted to try and figure out how to draw a comic very quickly. And so each panel, really, if you look at it, has pretty like minimal line work, and then I didn't know how to use watercolors, so I just used like really neon colors to try and to make it pop without having to actually know anything about like painting. Yeah, and I think the speed, you were asking about how that like fit the story. I think the speed at which I was able to like create images that I didn't hate too much, like allowed me to tell this story in a more kinetic way, you know, where I was actually drawing out every pose or panel that was important to telling this very movement-oriented story. I think when I was getting really detailed and fussy about like drawing every fold on everybody's sweater, I was trying to condense so much so that I wouldn't have to draw too many panels. And yeah, I think the speed of being able to work like this and put it online, yeah, definitely influenced sort of mechanical tone of the piece.
And I think the next story of yours, a lot of people saw online. This, I believe you may have published this first as a kind of zine, but most people probably saw it on Tumblr. Is this story Hawaii 1997, which has been collected in a little book that Uncivilized Press. Do they have it this week?
No, I think they forgot it, but it's going to be at TCAP.
Thomas really has a lot on his plate.
Yeah.
He's a wonderful, wonderful man. But this story, Hawaii 1997, this seems to have really gotten a lot of people's attention online. And this is a really kind of just interesting, to me, sort of study in contrast. It's like, it has this very handmade look that reproduces so well digitally. It has, there's something about it where, it's got this really nice sense of being able to see kind of like the sketch lines and the erasures and stuff like that. The other thing that's really interesting to me about this is that, like Haunter, it also does have some sequences that are very movement-oriented. The individual small pages are not very dense, so it really lends itself to a kind of internet scrolling kind of experience. And yet, I think the artwork, because it has the sort of richness of a kind of textural quality, it sort of mitigates against like speed reading and forgetting or some. Do you know what I mean? I don't know. I mean, was any of this stuff on your mind when you were making this, or what was the genesis of this particular story?
Yeah, no. Well, the actual genesis was that I just had a really long plane ride, and I had a moleskin and a mechanical pencil, and I started drawing this comic, and I was drawing it very, very small, so maybe like 2 or 3 inches tall, so that I could use the pencil like a much sort of softer, less crappy art supply. And yeah, I think forcing myself into that, forcing those constraints on myself did sort of create that that texture. And yeah, sorry, what you?
That's okay. No, I mean you're doing fine, and it's just interesting too. And then this. One of the things that I think is interesting, as I was kind of preparing and sort of going through some of your recent stuff, and it kind of seems like you'll do something and try something, and then sort of fold it into the next thing that you do that maybe tries something else. So it's kind of like Haunter has, some of that movement. Then you go back, it's all movement. Then you make something that's a little bit more of a comic, but it still has this quality of movement that we see here. But it has this kind of additional sort of nice pencil quality, and then you've sort of learned that, and then your next couple stories retain some of the kind of looseness of the Hawaii story, but then you're sort of bringing back a kind of more crisp, like panel-to-panel type storytelling here, and that's true also of a Backyard that's available online, and Household as well, again, but sort of taking the pencil into an even softer sort of realm.
Yeah, well, the pencil, it's funny because I don't know, I was so like Team Ink all the way for so long, and I think giving myself permission to draw comics in pencil and to draw comics that, this, like the anatomy and stuff in this comic is totally goofballs. It doesn't make sense at all, but, and it was drawn direct to paper without, with like planning, but without any like pre-drawing. I think that for something like this story is kind of an intense one about incest and stuff. It was something that I just needed to draw really quickly before I had time to overthink it, and I just had to get it out on the page, and I think that's also given me the I don't know, it's being able to work that softly also somehow changes the quality of the story, I think. When the lines are that soft and the characters don't look as much like logos or graphic elements, I think that you relate to them differently. I think you are less aware of them as individuals or characters and more aware of them as concepts, you know, as like, they're more formless.
And your latest printed publication that I saw, or most recent one that I saw, I think was this thing called Wicked Chicken Queen. And this is very different from the other stuff. In some ways it goes back to maybe some of the early anthropomorphism, but it's got this almost, I don't know, illuminated manuscript kind of page structure. How did you decide to approach the structure of these pages differently?
Well, I wanted to do a really tall book, and that's kind of it. That's sort of my story about it. I just wanted to do like a tall, skinny thing, and I don't know. I was just exploring a lot of, you know how I think everybody who draws has some kind of like suite of visual fetishes that they draw over and over and over. And if they get bored with it, they try and find like a new way to make it interesting. And for me, it's like chickens and islands and I don't know, and some other stuff, maybe like tree shadows or something. But basically, every page of this book was both a chicken and an island. Like literally, it's about this chicken. Sometimes the chicken is in an island. Yeah, that was it. This was a drawing book.
And this is a very recent story, and this again shows a kind of move towards different kinds of material. It looks to me like a pen line, and it's got a certain number of effects that I think were probably imposed digitally, like sort of the equivalent of shading film, except that you're very specifically referencing iconography from computers. Was this to get away from working on pencil?
Yeah, definitely. This is this comic about this kind of like, it's like a horror story that takes place in this corporate environment, and I kind of wanted it to look like a hypercard game or something that I would play on like the Apple II. Yeah, and so this was kind of I think I freak out whenever somebody says like, oh, that's your thing, and I have this weird like teenage rebellion, and I go, no, this completely opposite thing, that's my thing. And so I think I was trying to do that with this comic, was get away from the pencil and handmade stuff.
Are you? This is a page that you posted recently. Is this a work in progress?
Yeah, yeah. I redrew this with a different grid. But,
yeah, it's kind of interesting too, because it's sort of like this thing of doing something and then folding it into the next project, in the sense that like you did this thing that was meant to look like a hypercard game. It's got a real kind of hard-edged look to it, and here it seems like it's combining the softness of the pencil with some of the more structured drawing of the ink work.
Yeah, well, something that had sort of come naturally with the pencil stuff is I was just doing big panels, like 2 panels per page, and often no gutter. And something I learned with that earlier sort of hardline comic was that 6-panel grid actually works as well as everyone says it does. And I don't know, for some reason changing the materials let me do that, so I started trying to apply that to this.
Okay. And Fred, my understanding is that your first published work was in issues of a Belgian anthology called Frigobox that was published, I guess, by the company that came to be known as Frayon.
Yes,
in Belgium.
Yes.
You studied at a school called Saint-Luc in Brussels.
In Brussels, yes.
Yes, and this school. I think there's a much fuller story to be told one day outside of this context about this school and Brussels and Frayon and Amok. We've had some of those artists here in the U.S. before. Thierry Van Hasselt was in Brooklyn in 2012, and Eric Lambé was in the U.S. This past year. So I feel like we're starting to learn bits and pieces of this story here. But you were really part of a group of artists who were interested in comics, but came from an art school environment and were interested in sort of combining techniques and methods traditionally associated with fine art, but introducing, I think, an element of narration. Is that a fair description of?
Yes, a very fair description. Yes.
Uh-huh.
And we always started to, well, we work alone. Every member of the publisher work his own project alone.
Mm-hmm.
So we started mainly to work with technique to build something that will be a book.
Mm-hmm.
But so there is no formal obligation to finish with something that looks like a comics.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you're working towards making books, and then you see what happens. Basically.
Yes, and sometimes it's just getting something else in a book, like paintings.
Now you were working in the etching form, right? Is this like copper plate etching?
I like to work on copper or zinc.
Uh-huh.
It's the same. It's just metal and acid. Etchings.
Mm-hmm. Were you focused on printmaking in art school?
I started in art school in Brussels
Mm-hmm.
The last year, and this picture, well, it's not very easy to see, but
I don't have these issues. These were the only images I could find on from this. I think it was a weird Japanese website.
I was a student, so I print. It was a project of open narration, just to make like all the drawings on a separate plate and mix them to build a renewable story.
Okay.
So you have the characters, the places, the events, and like a mixed and
So this was given to you as an assignment by a teacher to sort of do a printmaking project that could build into a kind
well,
of
no, I
narrative.
was searching a way to like you, to not to feel the pressure of doing a comic. It's a lot of pressure, a lot of time. It's very tiring, and I started to paint, to draw, to think about how to use and to mix new technique, and I feel that the etching is a good way to open new doors.
Did you go to this art school with the idea that you were going to make comics?
Well, it's really a comics art school, so everybody was doing comics. The engraving studio was a little bit abandoned. There was not so many people doing engraving in that period. Maybe that's why I went.
Yeah. And this this led to your first full-length project, Hortus Sanitatus, and this is the first of two large, entirely engraved graphic novels. And this seems, I don't have this book, I think it's out of print now, I have the other one, but it seems, based on the images that I can see, that this has a much more direct kind of narrative sense of sequencing than the work that you did in those anthologies.
Yeah, well, each book I want to try something else. So this one was the first. I was a student in another school in France, in an art school, but I was invited by Frederic by same publisher, that changed the name several times, to participate on a workshop in 2000. They invited several artists to make books about Brussels. So I was invited 2 months, and we had 2 months to do comics. So I visited the town. I realized that there is a lot of pictures about death in the museums, and also about Maria, the Virgin.
Oh, right.
So I started to mix the two characters to build a story, and also Brussels is kind of chaotic structure. It's a very weird city. They mixed medieval streets with big towers and brick buildings. Everything is mixed. And while I tried to build a comic that reflects the monstrosity of the city, so there's a lot of monsters also that are.
This has a very kind of open look. You also made a small book called Ars Simia Naturae. This actually can be found online now on Uli Lust's Electrocomics website, and this has a much kind of darker ground. There's a sort of device where one character is sort of peeking through a keyhole to see what's happening in another room. Was this a conscious attempt to try and use the possibilities of the plate differently?
Yeah, I paint on the well, I did a normal etching process, and then I just remove partly the ink. So I print with large black areas.
I see.
It's like painting. It's like monotype and etching mixed.
Oh, I see. I see. And then the other very large etched book project, which is really a beautiful book, is this one. The English title, as we see on the cover, is "The Hero's Life and Death Triumphant." This again, particularly compared to the first one, you know, which it seems kind of like everything is. There's a sense of openness, but all the figures are sort of delineated in a maybe more clear way. Whereas here, there's just a lot of kind of openness and half drawings that you maybe only draw partial forms. Had your approach to making comics using etching changed in between these books? Do you think? Did you have a different idea about how etching could be used to make comics, or was it just that your drawing was changing?
Both, I suppose. I wanted to push a little bit more the process of an opened comic. Every chapter is more unlinked with the rest of the story. It's a little bit more open. I started with the idea of a long project, and so I have more space to open the narration. It's
a really beautiful book. It's this book and also your next one especially deal a lot with these themes of war, and it's just funny we're in this room with all these pictures of like the soldiers on the walls, you know. But you know, I'd seen a lot of people sort of knew about these books because very occasionally small quantities of them would come into the United States. I feel like I know a lot of artists who have a copy of these books. I went to France a few years ago and saw your latest published book, and it really surprised me because I just had this idea in my head of like, oh, that guy's so great, everything he does using etching, and then I saw this book and I was like, whoa, it's the same artist, but it's in a completely different material, using completely different materials. This book, Lyonnaise. I'm going to show a few images from this book. Every page is painted. It's a very difficult book to read, first of all, because it's just very poetic and associative, and you really have to kind of stay in it. It's also technically difficult to read because it has French, English, Latin, German, maybe some Spanish. Yeah, I don't know anyone maybe who can maybe read the whole book straight through, but with just in terms of the language, maybe there are some people out there who can. But my understanding is that every comics page is 4 separate pieces of paper that you painted on. Can you talk about the materials that you used and why you changed your way of working?
There are all painting on papers. The page with the 4 pictures is something like 1 meter by 50 or 60, something like that.
So it's like big like this.
Yeah.
It's 4 maybe like A4 pieces of paper or something.
It's like 4 A3 or a little bit more than an A3. And I wanted to work on the text because comics use the text, and I never feel really easy to manage the junction between the text and the drawings. The traditional comic school use the bubble, but I'm not fan about this process, so I started to think about how to mix painting, text, or to use the text as a part of the drawing or the painting, and to work truly the text. So that's why it's some kind of poetic form by the end.
Did you draw, were you making these images individually and then composing them as pages, or did you approach each page with a very specific plan?
Yeah, I painted the four pictures at the same time.
Okay.
I built the book by changing sometimes, inverting the pages, but the paintings are painted like that, the four images together.
Okay. And had you started, I know that you also, you exhibit, paintings and drawings in galleries too. I found a few, actually several images online on your gallery's website. Had you started working with painting and then you decided to make a comic using those techniques, or did you just become interested in using painting for a comic because it would allow you to mix the text and images the way that you were describing? Was it the painting that came first, or the change in approach to comics?
Well, of course I painted before I do the comics, of course.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm painting since years,
Okay.
like from childhood, of course.
Okay, so do you feel that you've finished with the etching technique for making comics?
I'm working on a new project with etchings.
Oh, okay.
It's a mix with etchings and oil painting. They are much more figurative than the first book, because in this first book the main effort was on the text and the paintings. I wanted to do an open book with abstract paintings, figuration, quickly done painting, and the next one will be more, what is the name for that, more worked.
Yeah. Okay.
And the painting are very big, it's like 2 meters by 1.60 meters.
Okay. So it's incorporating the painting and the etching together in a more kind of figurative.
It will be like the old comics they did 2 black and white pages and then 2 colors pages. So it's the same rhythm for the pages, but well, it's also a superhero story.
Oh, really? What is
I'm
your
finishing the story.
what is your
Maybe next
superhero
week.
like?
Well, it's a surprise.
Okay. We're really at the end of our time. I would like to offer an opportunity for one person to ask a question, in case anyone is dying to ask a question of any or all of the panelists here. Is there anyone who's going to be brave that way? Yes?
When you work in different styles, do you ever have any problem when you're working on a long piece that the style starts to shift as you're going along? That's for any of all of them.
Yeah, I think we've all probably. I mean, even I remember. I think a lot of us have read, for example, like those interviews with Daniel Clowes where he talks about how he had to, when he collected Ghost World, he had to go back and redraw some of the faces because at the beginning of the book they all look a little different. Has anyone had any problems working on a long form story? You mentioned shaving that character's head, but stylistically, in terms of the way you draw, has that come up for anyone?
I used to be more worried. I don't do a lot of long form stories, but I used to be more worried about that being an issue. And I find things like that will even change, like in the course of a 20-page story. Like the first page, I haven't figured out the rules of everything yet. But it used to bother me, but then I kind of realized there's so many books that, I mean, like there's so many comics and novels and anything that have that quality to them, and it doesn't bother me when I read those things. Like I always think of Gaylord Phoenix by Edie Fake.
Oh yeah.
And how Edie's style gets so refined by the end of it, and that's a quality to it that I really love about it. So I stopped worrying about that in my own work.
And that works really nicely in that book too, because it's almost like metaphorical journey of self-definition or something, you know, so it's sometimes nice when those things work out. Well, please join me in thanking our panelists for being here today.